Extras. Dragons have an extraordinarily low birth rate, which makes pretty good ecological sense, given that many of them are over 1,000 years old, so old that it's unsure whether or not they are clinically immortal. But there are also a great many colors of dragon: red, blue, black, white, green, gold, bronze, silver, and others as well, each with significant differences in their physiological and mystical traits. In fact, the number of dragons in this world could not possibly support enough breeding pairs to maintain the genetic diversity of each of those different breeds. So, how do you end up with so many different kinds? Well, dragons of every hue and sheen are able to interbreed, and when they do, something very interesting happens. There's only a 50 or 60% chance that their offspring are the same color as either of their parents. The rest of the time, the hatchling could be any color of dragon that exists, even if both parents were the same type. According to the dragon's own legends, which we know through Dragonborn refugees, they say that it is because the blood of a god, Tiamat the many-headed and many-hued, runs so strongly through their veins that they are each as much a child of that lost goddess as they are of their own parents. It is perhaps because of this, or maybe some contest of nature versus nurture, that dragons in our world have only a tendency towards the alignment normally ascribed to their color by various monster manuals. A gold dragon is more likely to be good, and a red dragon is more likely to be evil, but any individual could just as well be different, or even the reverse. Of course, there's yet another whole set of weirdness about dragon breeding, which is where Little One comes in. Most adult dragons in this setting have the ability to shapeshift into humanoids, while some ancient dragons can shapeshift into almost any type of creature. When they do so, they temporarily forego many of their natural advantages, their lethal, bestial, and breath weapons, but they still maintain a rather surprising degree of their strength and of their toughness, which has allowed some to masquerade as human or elven heroes through history, or villains. But being bearers of the blood of a chaotic god has also made possible some rather awkward half-breeds when they engage in relationships while shapeshifted. Humans and occasionally monsters can be born with draconic scales and wings, or dragon-like claws and fangs, as well as some of their natural spellcasting abilities. And then again, there's Little One, whose flesh is somewhat tougher than a normal human's, and he has a little more natural strength, but he has none of the gross physical changes you'd expect. No visible sign that he's a half-dragon. He doesn't spread that fact around a lot, so we don't have any expert theories to go on, except what his mother has told him, which is that when she was pregnant with him, she stayed in human form the entire 9 months. She told him that the more time the mother spends in dragon form while carrying, the more visible dragon traits the child will take on. Then again, she's also showed him the egg that he hatched from, which doesn't necessarily conflict with the story, but it is a little confusing nonetheless. Though many people mistake them as being some type of half-dragon hybrid, the creation of the Dragonborn is somewhat more mysterious than that. I mean, it is known that the greatest of the Dragon Lords and Ladies are extremely powerful, and were even in the distant past, but to create a new sentient race seems like an impossible feat, even for them. One theory among scholars of history and of the arcane says that the dragons actually changed a race of lizard men which already lived on the continent of Novendil, reshaping them in their own image, and indoctrinating them to believe the dragons were their gods. The Eladrin have confirmed that the Feywild version of the Draconic lands are inhabited by lizardmen in places, but the whole truth of this may never be clear. Dragonborn come in many varieties, not quite as many as dragons themselves, but quite a few of them. And for a very long time, they served as willing slaves to their godlike masters. After all, even if the dragons created their self-serving religion, one cannot deny that their size, their age, their power, and their personalities make them very much like unto the gods, especially to these comparatively tiny humanoids who are trained and educated from birth to serve them. This relationship continued for centuries, and although they were effectively slaves, because the ratio of servants to masters was so great, the Dragonborn were really their own society. They had towns, families, industries to sustain themselves and to cater to the whims of their draconic lords. And because the Dragonborn don't share the lifespan of true dragons, there is little information on them from the ancient times, but It seems that they were quite content with their lot until about 1100 years ago, when the greed of the fat and lazy dragons extended to coveting the lands and treasures of their neighbors. This was the beginning of the feudal age of the Dragon Lords. As small, self-serving wars became more commonplace and the elder dragons became more lax about interceding, many dragons rescinded the ban on weapons among their servants, arming and training their pseudo-nations of Dragonborn, mobilizing them to lay siege to one another. Over about 150 years, a number of dragons were slain, and soon small networks of defensive alliances formed, threatening to embroil the two continents, Novendil and Harrowan, in something resembling a world war, a conflict totally unknown to nearly any human, elf, or dwarf. This grave possibility finally motivated the eldest of the dragons to form a council to set down rules and enforce peace amongst their lesser cousins. And so life went back to normal for the Dragonborn. Except they did not forget. Because when you have seen the horrors of war, seen the pettiness of your gods, and most of all, seen them bleed and die just as you do, it becomes less easy to sublimate yourself to their will. But although many of the surviving Dragonborn from the war-torn areas had been trained to battle against dragons, they had a fresh sense of the brutal, unstoppable power of a dragon's wrath. And so, newly arisen leaders amongst the servants began to plan their eventual liberation, a plan those same elders would never live to see, nor would their grandchildren. But over generations, the knowledge of writing, of magic, and all the other arts of war were secretly spread among the Dragonborn. And all the while they redoubled their servile efforts and the deference they showed to their masters, attempting to fatten them up further and to lure them into a false sense of security, so that many years later, someday, their people could rise up and free themselves. And so it was that 470 years ago, after centuries of slow waiting and spreading of the word from fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, the Dragonborn finally made their move. The servants of nearly all of the Dragon Lords launched attacks on the same day. They were successful in slaying several dragons in their sleep, but even with total access and intimate knowledge of the false gods, to kill a dragon is not an easy thing, and most of the palatial lairs erupted in desperate violence. Dragons shrieked out, shaking off their attackers like so many ants, swooping back to strafe them with elemental force, only partially resisted by the most powerful magics the Dragonborn priests and wizards had prepared. Meanwhile, the most powerful warriors and spellcasters of the rebels were concentrated into the teams sent to destroy Lord Archithrax of the Red, the head of the Council of Elders. Overall, only a handful of dragons actually died, but many were wounded badly, and nearly all of them were driven off, then were shocked even further when they regrouped to find that the wise and mighty Lord Archithrax was among the dead. The Dragonborn had triumphed, staking out most of the continent of Novendil for their own, though they consolidated their numbers and their treasures in a smaller area, which they felt they could hold against dragon attacks and other threats. It was a land they named Freeborn, for that is what the next generation and every generation thereafter would be. They would be born free. That would be a great ending for the story, but sadly, it was not the end. The inhabitants of Freeborn had to live in perpetual readiness for a return of the dragons. Dragons are notorious for both their patience, their long memories, and their vengeful nature, so there was never any question that they would be back. On the other hand, no society in history has been as expert at fighting dragons as the Dragonborn. Before the rebellion, they had dug secret tunnels beneath their land, akin to bomb shelters, usually beneath 20 to 30 feet of rock, with multiple entrances, making them more accessible and harder to seal off, each one built with vent shafts and switchbacks to prevent most forms of breath weapon from penetrating to the interior. Their wizards, in their generations of preparing, had created an enchantment spell similar to flame arrows, but which could instead create dozens of dragonbane arrows, which they could spread among many archers, hoping they could each hit with one or two for a massive alpha strike. And they had created a small number of elemental immunity artifacts to protect their most heroic figures from the breath weapons of the specific dragon types. And with these and other preparations and training, they managed to withstand roughly one attack per generation from the exiled dragons, and a great deal of harassment from those dragons who remained or who had moved back into the part of the continent outside the defenses of Freeborn. But they were not prepared for the attack which came 49 years ago. one of the oldest and most cunning living dragons, Lord Paragos of the Blue, led his own force to retake Novendil. In previous attempts, the proud dragons thought so little of their opponents that they assumed merely rallying enough of them together could overcome the pissant former slaves, only to be rebuffed by shockingly well-prepared and determined foes defending their homes and families. Unlike his predecessors, Lord Paragos had long studied and analyzed the Dragonborn, spying and scrying their defenses, learning their weaknesses and their strengths, and his conclusion was quite simply that their strength was their expertise against dragons. As for his determination of their weaknesses, it may not be as simple to explain, but it could perhaps be expressed best by his army of choice, the Death Knights. When the Freeborn Revolution happened, it was a broad movement across almost the entire land, in the territory of nearly every dragon except those who lived across the sea on their sister continent, Harwan. But it was never as clean, as pure, as united as that sounds. The dragons were their living gods, and that religion was still taught everywhere, officially, in the open, while the resistance was shared carefully, secretly in dark recesses. Though a small minority of the population, there were nevertheless many of the dragon's closest guards and retainers who remained loyal to their masters. Most of these loyalists were kept out of the loop of the insurgency, while a few of those who were told simply discounted it, not believing that a revolution could ever succeed, or that the people would ever have the nerve to rise up in their own lifetime. When the rebels did move, both of these groups had a very difficult decision to make, some of them with only a brief instant to choose between allowing their lord or lady to be attacked, or fighting and possibly killing their own kind. It was a day of countless tragedies, for every possible side of the conflict. Some dragons wiped out their servants to the last man, woman, and child. Dragonborn fought Dragonborn in places, inevitably scarring the minds of the winners. Other dragons died, and with those deaths, centuries of knowledge and secrets were lost. Endless artworks and treasures in the cavernous lairs were destroyed as collateral damage, either by the attacker's spells, or more often, by the terrifying power of draconic fire, ice, lightning, or acid. It is said that within the lair of Lord Archithrax, you could fry an egg on the floor as long as 4 hours after the battle, a floor which was ever after paved with a mix of melted gold and melted stone from the cataclysm unleashed by the great red dragon. How Lord Paragos found them is a mystery. What dark arts did he employ? Where did he acquire the knowledge, the bodies? Regardless of the answers, Paragos had assembled a small, elite force of Dragonborn Death Knights, skeletons and souls of those who had been slain in battle, or those who, along with their masters, had fought off the surprise assault, and as reward had kept their posts, or had been evacuated to Harwan by their masters. Every one of them had died or lived with the most bitter of emotions, feeling betrayed, or feeling that they had themselves betrayed their own kind, killed or been killed by their friends and neighbors. This bitterness, this hatred, had made them ripe for conversion into deadly, intelligent undead, all raised and bound to obey Lord Paragos, or a handful of other old, wise dragons who had joined his cause. When they attacked, the dragons provided air cover, controlled areas, cast buffs, and carefully commanded their forces without exposing themselves to undue danger. Meanwhile, the heavily armored Death Knights, laden with deadly magic gear, could much more easily penetrate the narrow corridors of the shelters, could fight in a manner which the living Dragonborn were much less adept at countering, and were not affected by the many magical Dragonbane spells and weapons that awaited them. The Dragonborn were only partially trained at combating other humanoids. They had rarely used those skills in real life and death battle, and they were even less experienced at dealing with undead skeletons who could shrug off dozens of the arrows which were so deadly when massed against their ancestral foe. The Dragonborn were driven from their shelters only to be picked off by strafing from above. When it was all over, only about 1,000 citizens of Freeborn escaped, and only a few hundred survived the desperate journey across the ocean to the Elven coast. The Death Knight encountered by the party had been a paladin of Bahamut, the name given to Sirius by the Dragonborn, who envisioned the goddess as a great platinum dragon. Despite worshipping a real god, he still believed at least partially in the pseudo-religion of dragon worship. But more importantly, the paladin has sworn oaths to his master and had been one of those put in the position of defending the dragon against his own people. An even more impossible position for a paladin of the god of protection and of justice. He ended up killing at least one of the attackers, and then was himself killed, failing in his oath and the defense of his master. All this was too much for his beleaguered spirit, which became trapped by his anguish, unable to transition. Centuries later, Lord Paragos had found his bones and bound his service to the spirit of a new master. And whether or not it was the dragon's intention, the former paladin was tortured further, 100 times more, by being commanded to slaughter his own kind. As far as stats are concerned, I didn't find any of the Death Knights from various monster manuals particularly compelling. My idea of a Death Knight was fit much better by building a straight-class Duskblade for their armored swift spells and spell-charged melee attacks. Then I simply added a homemade template which amounted to standard undead traits, skeleton damage reduction, a little fire resistance, and some minor stat increases. Finally, I added 2 special abilities. The ability to cast Wave of Fatigue once per day, a 30-foot cone which causes fatigue with no save, and an at-will ability to conjure those disconcerting bone walls as a swift action, each casting creating 3 consecutive squares of 10-foot-high bone wall. The walls have AC 14 and 16 hit points per square, that's 5 plus 1 per caster level, and become difficult terrain after being smashed, though if you do an extra 16 damage, you can destroy a second square of wall in the very same action, and any fire damage will clear the difficult terrain. The walls are a very strong tactical ability for blocking line of sight and for blocking charges, but they're slightly less strong than they sound for my Death Knights because of the poor synergy between this ability and the megatons of swift spellcasting that Duskblades already have. They still only get 1 swift action per round, so now they have to choose. Though the party's reluctance to enter his obscuring mist gave him time to set up a nice little maze while buffing himself. It has been mentioned that Vistria has a penchant for dirt-obvious place names. Just looking at provinces, we have such gems as Bord, a border province, Forever, where they built a fort by the river. There's the barony of Silverlode, which contains valuable silver mines, and the comparatively poetic barony of White Bear, said to be the first place where the Smiths people ever saw a polar bear. And all of these are within the Duchy of Newland, which is established to govern the new land. While it's easy to make fun of this rather pedestrian nomenclature, to do so may be a little unfair given the era in which most of these places were named. Most of humanity had been united by the Smith, forming his kingdom, which would later become Verandi. But Smith was not one to rest on his laurels. There were dangerous tribes of savage humanoids, goblins and bugbears, living beyond the notional borders of the new nation, and those launched raids against the precarious human settlements. Smith, who happened to be in the area, fought off one bugbear raid led by an ogre, but he was puzzled that the ogre appeared to be following a plan which seemed to be dictated by someone else. One big monster taking leadership of a band of smaller monsters is a pretty common arrangement, but the suggestion of a larger organized structure was very unusual, and so the hero grabbed a few other stalwart souls who had helped against the raid and headed into the wilderness to find the bandits' base or village. And that was the beginning of the campaign against the Green Witch. After many adventures, each worthy of a tale or two, Smith and his party defeated the hag and the remaining goblinoid tribes in her thrall scattered to the winds, leaving a large chunk of land relatively free for the taking. This led to the most rapid territorial expansion in the short history of the human people, as all manner of ambitious or adventurous souls moved into the new land area, and as they discovered that the unexplored Vistrian peninsula continued further to the north and to the west than anyone had imagined. 2 great ships were constructed back at Smith's capital, the town called Forge. These ships formed the hallowed Vistrian expedition, following the coastline, past Grey Beach, past the imposing twin mountains which seemed to rise straight up out of the sea, the place which would much later become the site of the great castle. They sailed on ever farther until their provisions ran low, and, with no end in sight, they stopped in the open fields of a place which they called Landing. And so this is the climate in which many of these provinces, towns, and terrain features were named. It was an unparalleled burst of exploration, where every day the adventurers and settlers and explorers would see hills, streams, rocks, and fields that no human had ever laid eyes on before. It's no wonder that many of the names were simple descriptive ones, and a lot of them stuck, persisting through the ages. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know if you have any questions about Tales from my D&D campaign, about the game setting, or about being a game master in general. I'm not really an expert, but I'll see what I can do.